Here at the Cannon Beach Library, and I'm happy to welcome you to our first uh, meeting of our 2023 Northwest Author Series. Uh, Today we'll be hosting our writer, who is Jon Raymond today, and Jon has received an Oregon Book Award. He has received an He's been an Emmy Award-winning screenwriter. His last novel, Denial, was a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice for 2022. He's also written other books such as The Half-Life, Rain Dragon, and Freebird, and a story collection called Livability. He's also collaborated on 6 films. He received an Emmy Award nomination for his screenwriting on the HBO series Mildred Pierce. Unfortunately, the flyer that you saw is inaccurate, and there are no books for sale here because someone forgot to order them. But I won't tell you who that was.
You're taking a fifth?
But I'm pleading the fifth. And there are little stones under your chair, so you can start throwing them.
Now you guys could have like doubled my sales.
But I can tell you, if you go to Amazon right now, the hardback version of Denial is available for a really good price. So just wanted to
That's the dawn of sale.
No, I had nothing to do with it. Please join me in welcoming Jon Raymond.
Hi guys, thank you so much for coming out. I haven't been at the coast in a really long time. I was telling Doug and Linda both, this is not to like insult my wife at all, but she is very phobic about the tsunami out here. And like a lot of people in Portland, after that big New Yorker article came out about the earthquakes and stuff, we just haven't come out to the coast. So it's been like 5 years since I've been out here. So it's kind of incredible to finally set foot here again. Not that I've actually seen the water yet, but all that said, if there is a tsunami while we're sitting here, like, do you guys all know where to go and what to do?
Oh, yeah.
All right, I'll follow you guys.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. We
Basically
drove
run east.
basically run.
Or
Yeah. Right. Okay. Yeah, we were driving down the coast a few years ago and down kind of near Bandon or something, and like stopped just to walk around on the water somewhere. And suddenly, like, we heard these crazy klaxons, like you just hear this like, bah, bah, and my wife and one of my daughters just went like running, me and one of the other daughters just kind of stood there and like whatever. And we got back to the like hotel parking lot and we're like, what was that? They're like, oh, that was just the volunteer fireman's like siren. It's 2 for them and 1 for a tsunami. So if you hear 2, it's like, how are we supposed to know like what's what, But then she also said, she's like, and if you hear that thing, you're basically already dead. So don't worry about it. Not true here. Yeah, good. Okay, I guess I'll read a little bit from this Denial book. There's a little part of me that was going to read a short story, but that'll take too long. I think I'm not going to do that. I could do a complete short story, more like a chapter, unless there's like some great desire to hear like a short story. But I'll just do this. This is easier. Okay, I'll tell you a little bit about the book before I read it. This is my first attempt into anything like science fiction or speculative fiction. It takes place about 30 years in the future in 2052, after a global Green New Deal has transformed the world partially, like not a quite as radical a change as people might have imagined, but things have happened. Part of the global Green New Deal that occurred were something called the upheavals, which were kind of mass uprisings of populist revolt about the petroleum economy, and that included Nuremberg-style trials of major carbon criminals. So major CEOs and executives of oil companies and stuff were put on trial. The premise of this book is a journalist named Jack something. Forget his last name right now. Discovers a carbon criminal in hiding down in Guadalajara, Mexico, and goes down to reveal and uncover this carbon criminal. So in a sense, it's kind of like a Nazi hunter story in like eco drag, and so is how I describe it. And so the chapter I'm going to read to you from, so what happens is a kind of something like a affection or friendship kind of kindles between this journalist and this executive in hiding. And they're kind of a sequence of conversations they have leading up to what will be the ultimate unveiling, which the journalist and his journalist sort of cadre are referring to as the Donaldson, because it will be somewhat akin to a story that Sam Donaldson did in the 1990s, where he tracked down a Nazi in Argentina and accosted him on the street. So that's what this is leading to. But this is what I'm going to read to you from is the penultimate meeting between these two guys, which often take place in the coffee shop at the regional museum. That's where the executive likes to hang out. So yeah, this Jack has come to. He needs to like establish an actual date with the executive in order to pounce on him. He needs to establish an actual date with him in the future so he can accost him with a cameraman and stuff. So yeah. Cave's face lit up as soon as he saw me in the cafe. I was sitting at my regular seat, drinking my regular order, sending off signals of easy familiarity and welcome. Once he had his coffee in hand, he came directly over to wish me a happy new year. "How's Cabo?" I said, making room at the table. "Absurd," he said, taking off his coat. "Maggie is right. It's a terrible place. We'll never go again." "That's too bad," I said. "I hope the weather was nice at least." "It was fine," he said. "We saw a pod of gray whales on our last day. That was the highlight, I'd say. That was quite incredible, in fact." He sat down and held forth about the migration patterns of whales. "They birth their calves in Baja and migrated to Alaska every year," he said, "which constituted one of the longest maritime migrations in the world. They traveled over 12,000 miles in all, and the trip kept getting longer as the ice caps receded. On the way north, the new mothers hugged the shoreline with their new calves in tow, fending off orcas and stray fishing nets, while the bulls made the trip later, not helping in the least." As he talked, I kept on the lookout for any opportunities to bring up the bullfight. He's going to invite him to a bullfight so that they can, that's the excuse he'll use. I didn't want to force the subject, but I didn't want to wait too long either. If the invitation failed, I'd have to think of another strategy. At the very least, I wanted to come away with his coordinates on Sunday. So at the first lull in conversation, apropos of nothing, I went ahead and mentioned the bullfight and my interest in his company. "Bullfight, eh?" he said. "Not too many gringos going to bullfights these days. What makes you want to witness that form of barbarity?" "I want to see one while I still have the chance," I said. "They won't be around much longer, from what I understand." And just so you know, the executive is like in his late 70s probably, and the journalist is in his late 40s. So there's sort of a, generational divide. "Oh, they'll be around," he said. "Don't worry about that. People complain about them, but the bullfight is one of humanity's most ancient rituals. At the very beginning of civilization, men were encircling a plot of dirt and watching other men kill bulls. I imagine they'll be doing it at the very end, too. That's a depressing thought, I said. Is it? He said. No one even protests them down here anymore. People realize they just go underground. They become like cockfights, even worse. At least this way there's some regulation. The meat still goes to the poor. Well, I'm planning to go this Sunday, I said. If you're interested, I'd love a good guide. Dave seemed to mull the invitation. He stared off into the room for a moment, retrieving a memory or imagining some future, I couldn't tell which. When he came back to me, he had his answer. Of course, he said, I'd love to go. I haven't seen a bullfight in quite some time. So it was agreed. The backstory about the Matador's redemption hadn't even been necessary. We would meet on Sunday and walk to the arena from the cafe. After that, we enjoyed another hour of rambling, amiable conversation, nursing our coffees, eating our pastries. For the first time, Cave showed some interest in my own life story. He asked me questions about my youth in Ohio, and I told him about my old neighbors and the trees that now covered my childhood territory. For 20 years, I said, the government had been planting trees in the region by the thousands, tough weed-like varieties and hardwoods, species intended to endure whatever climate came next. At this point, every empty lot and side street had been seeded, and the early saplings had matured into stately trunks. When I went home now, I didn't recognize a thing. My child had been swallowed by a forest. He asked me about Sobe too, and I gave him the whole story of our meeting in the optometry department. I told him about our past together and even mentioned her voice, her eyes. I rarely talked openly about personal matters like that, but on this day I did. I was under the assumption that it was best to tell as much truth as possible when lying. Bury the lies in piles of truth, I thought. In the end, I even told him about our plan to see the totality. He and his new girlfriend are going to go see the solar eclipse. Anything that keeps Cave from suspecting what was really happening. Wonderful, he said, pleased by the news of my romantic fortune. Meeting for the second time is always the best. That's when you know something is meant to be. Where are you going for the eclipse exactly? To the beach, I said, a town called San Blas, not too far. Wonderful place, he said. Terrible mosquitoes, but beautiful jungle there. There's an old hotel on the coastline. They rebuilt it around the turn of the century. It's worth a look. I'll put that on our list, I said. Soon our coffee was finished and our plates were empty. A square of sun had edged onto our table, brightening the single zinnia in a glass. I started putting away my phone and book, Tom Sawyer, and we began our parting formalities. I told Cave to please say hello to Maggie for me. He told me she sent her best. He asked me what the rest of my day held. I told him I still had to rent a car among other travel duties. You don't have a car yet, he said. Not yet, I said. There are no cars to rent in Jalisco, he said. You don't think so? I said. He shook his head definitively. There are 2 million people coming to Mexico for the totality, he said. You can't get a car now. Oh, I said, and immediately started babbling about other options. We could take a bus, I said, or a taxi or some kind of rideshare deal. But even as I listed off the ideas, I could see that none of them were remotely plausible. I hadn't thought about the car, and because Guadalajara wasn't in the actual zone of totality, if we didn't get out of the city, we'd miss the whole thing. Why don't you just use my car? Dave said. Oh, I couldn't do that, I said. I have a car that I almost never use, he said. It could stand a little workout. You'd be doing me a favor. Oh, I don't know, I said. Absolutely, he said. Come on, we can get it right now. I'm not that far from here. I paused, unsure what to do. Refusing such a flagrant act of generosity would seem insane, I realized. It would possibly even come as a front. The offer he was making was about more than just the car, I could see. He was offering me his friendship, extending a credit that we could begin trading back and forth, possibly in perpetuity. To refuse the car would be, in a sense, to refuse him. If I wanted to keep him on the line, I had to accept. I don't know what to say, I said. Thank you. We walked to Cave's house to get the car. On the way, I acted as if the streets we traveled were all new to me, and I'd never seen any of the various landmarks he pointed out. The bar where the local businessmen gathered, the park where the fountain sprayed, the playground with the enormous, treacherous-looking climbing structure. All of it I pretended had never passed before my eyes. We turned onto his block and proceeded to his address, the now familiar two-story box with the red ceramic tile roof. Earlier in the week, I traced the building's line of ownership, which I discovered involved various shell companies and blind trusts, and predictably dropped off an abyss on the edge of the Cayman Islands. It was something I'd definitely be asking him about on Sunday. Beautiful place, I said. You've been here a long time? Pretty long, he said. It's humble, but it's home. Cave unlocked the gate with a wireless fob in his pocket. There was a high buzzing whine and a heavy metallic click. We pushed through the iron gate and walked into a yard of raked dirt surrounding a few picturesque rocks. Fallen seed pods and stray leaves littered the zen-like furrows, and a jasmine tree cast a maze of shadows. We climbed the steps, and Cave opened the front door into the cool maw of his interior. I entered behind him, taking in the scene. The decor in the entryway and what I could see of the living room was tasteful, well organized, and warmly brown. The walls were painted a cool taupe. The tiles visible in the kitchen were dark chocolate. The furniture was antique mid-century, cherry antique, and the artwork was modern, with a handmade Mesoamerican flavor. Cave was a man alone who managed to exert fine taste in his domain. He continued to impress. The car needs to charge, he said. It doesn't take very long. Come on, this way. I followed him to a side door and into a narrow carport where his car was parked. The car was a thing of incredible beauty, a giant emerald green stone freshly pulled from a mountain stream. The snout was mildly pointed, shark-like, and the back was mildly flared, so the whole object had the satisfying curves of a squared-off egg. Up in the US, people were into these retro deco lines lately, I'd noticed, but down in Mexico, they were still rare. The charging stations were only starting to stitch into a usable network. The batteries they have now are incredible, Cave said, as if answering my thoughts, plugging the car in to feed from solar panels on the roof. This guy can go over 2,000 miles on a single charge. They don't have a lot of stations down here yet, but with this ultra capacitor, you don't need to worry. You can get to the beach and back 3 times if you needed to. Even if you ran out of juice, you'd be okay. I haven't tried it yet, but they say the battery can be charged from space. Can you believe that? He leaned in the door and checked the battery's gauge on the control panel. It still needs a few minutes, he said. Coffee? We went back into the muffled tranquility of his cool beige house. He made us coffee and we sat down in the dining room at a teak table beside a sliding glass door covered in a sheer curtain with the lightest saffron tint. On the table was a vase with yellow tropical lilies. It was an arrangement that invited contemplation. Mostly we talked about the car. He clearly enjoyed talking about the advanced engineering it contained. The body's shell was made out of a carbon fiber forged from a polymer strong enough to withstand a direct hit from an 18-wheeler. The interior was upholstered in synthetic leather almost indistinguishable from real cowhide, and the onboard computer had the navigation capacity of a NASA satellite. It could give you CPR if you needed it. Not that he used any of that somatic tech. He was a privacy freak, he said, and didn't like sharing any genetic data with the mothership if he could possibly avoid it. As such, he disabled as much of the feedback loop as possible, so we'd be on our own in that regard, but he could switch on the guest function to give me access to most of the navigation devices. He passed me the key control, a polymer disc the size of a silver dollar. He said I wouldn't need anything else. They said we couldn't break the fossil fuel habit, he said, sipping his coffee, marveling again at the car's design, but they were wrong. The car is a wonder. It's remarkable how humanity can adapt. Thank God for the upheavals, I say. I wasn't sure how to respond to that. For most people I knew, Cave's sentiment would have been fairly normal. Most of them loved nothing more than expressing their nostalgia for the days of transformation, the explosion of solidarity that had been so undeniable, righteous, and interesting. It had been the crux of our adult lives, most all agreed. Solidarity with air, solidarity with earth. We still signed off with those words, the level of irony attached depending. Next usually came the reflexive cynicism and consternation about all the failed promises. The sellouts, the backstabbers, the compromisers, all too happy to leave the status quo intact. It was a subject to avoid unless you were among close friends, I'd found. The schismatics were still tricky to navigate, but coming from cave, denier, and hiding, the words held a different weight altogether. They seemed like a test. Some might say they went a little far, I said. I didn't want to push him too hard, but I was curious what else he might divulge. I was even seeing a small opening for the jackpot of tearful, guilty confession. It would alter our Donaldson plans, but it would be worth it. My glasses, as always, were recording the scene. I don't think so, he said. Not far enough, in my opinion. Hanging Jared Curtis, I said, life imprisonment for Bowen. Those are some very severe sentences for guys who didn't actually kill anyone. They were just executives, bureaucrats. So is Goering, he said. So is Himmler. The Toronto gang killed whole phylums. Someone had to be held accountable for all that carnage. That's how justice works. We choose someone and make an example so we know the limits. Those people stood for many. Someone had to be representative. He smiled as if nothing could be more uncontroversial. We were stepping into an odd irradiated landscape now. Strange shadows were falling. It was like we'd swapped masks and I was taking his role, he was taking mine. But did he know we'd swapped masks? I didn't know if he knew or not. This was either an act of supreme arrogance on his part or supreme vulnerability. I couldn't tell. They were only doing what we asked them to do, I said. They were feeding us what we wanted. We all burned the gas, we all ate the meat, but they paid the price for it. Maybe we should all pay a little more. He nodded, but not in agreement. I hear what you're saying, he said. I've had those arguments with myself. You don't blame the hand for a murder. You blame the whole human being. The mind and the body conspire. The system as a whole is at fault. But as a species, we had to make a statement. We had to draw a line. Cave went on in a more ruminative tone. I didn't understand it clearly myself at the time, he said. I was as bad as any of them. I thought we had to feed the fire or the whole machine would blow up. The furnace would go cold. It was the way I was raised. I assumed we had no other way. But you changed your mind, I said. I didn't understand how change occurred back then, he said. I look back and it's incredible to think how we used to function. We once blocked rivers and burned gas and coal to run our grids. One giant dam piping the energy everywhere, one giant nuke plant. That seems so crude now, so stupid when you can just harvest energy anywhere in little packets. A cell here, a cell there. Who knew we had to go back to the days of the textile mill with the spinning water wheel, little turbines everywhere? Why didn't that make sense to me in 2025? It didn't make sense to a lot of people, I said. We can't blame people for their misperceptions. It was widespread. No, I think you can, he said. That's the lesson of Toronto, isn't it? The Toronto trials are the sort of Nuremberg things. That's the lesson of Toronto, isn't it? Willful ignorance is no defense. Denial is an act of will. The Toronto gang was engaged in a systematic assault on life on Earth. They were profiteering from it, sowing disinformation. It was a death cult. You could say a lot of other people deserve to be on trial, sure. It could have been billions of people on trial, but everyone on that docket definitely deserved what they got. Not everyone got what they deserved, I said. We were standing on the cusp between deception and reality itself now. Would he reveal himself? Would he recognize my intentions? The air itself seemed to throb on the verge of rending. I suppose, he said. What about the ones who got away? I said, taking us another step. What about them? He said. The people on trial represented organizations. The names were arbitrary. But why stop there? I said. Why not indict the whole boards, the stockholders? That's childish, he said. You can't indict everyone. And anyway, they'll all be judged someday, even the consumers. You think so? I said. No, he said and laughed. A lot passes beneath notice. Some people escape judgments altogether. People would like to think there's some justice in the universe, a grand arc toward equality or fairness or something. But what in the world would suggest that's true? Justice. I don't think so. So did Toronto really change anything then, I said, or not? This was a genuine question I asked myself daily. Had anything been won? Had society progressed? Or had the chairs simply been shuffled? I looked around most days and it seemed like nothing had changed. I'd read that very morning about a junta in Africa secretly fracking its mountain ranges. The Global Coalition's satellite had discovered the sites, and there's nothing anyone could do. Something changed, he said. Most definitely, something changed. We changed as a society, as a species, we evolved. I wonder sometimes, I said. We did, he said, without any inkling of doubt in his voice. Individually, we became smaller, we became more like ants, and collectively, we became stronger, more conscious. We became stronger, and we became less free. The car finished charging. Dave guided me out of his narrow alleyway and sent me off with good cheer, tapping the hood, telling me to enjoy the drive, take my time. Pulling away, watching him in the rear view, I couldn't help but feel like a teenager taking off in Dad's car. Sobe's plane didn't arrive until the morning, so I had time for a little spin around the city to get used to the car's torque. The engine had good pickup, a charging, silent thrust at the slightest touch, and the tires cornered sweetly. The dashboard was pleasingly simple, only a single modest screen in the window, on the window, and the leather smell from the padded seats was mildly intoxicating. I enjoyed the looks I got from men and women on the sidewalk flying around in my green Seed. Driving through the streets, I wondered if Cave had been trying to tell me something in there. Had that been his confession? If so, it was an elegantly inexplicit one at best. He hadn't really confessed to anything except crimes of thought. I'd have to dig pretty deeply into his words to find anything that might be considered remorse. Or possibly it was all just a feint. He might have been speaking directly to the camera. Maybe he already knew who I was. He was already talking to the judge, saying, I'm reformed, I've changed. He was a few steps ahead yet again. Or maybe he really meant what he'd said. He'd come to see the world in a different light. He knew he was lucky that he'd slipped the noose, and his good fortune had changed his heart. I was pretty sure he had no idea what was happening. He had no idea that in a matter of days he'd be revealed to the world and hauled away and jailed by the global legal bureaucracy. He didn't know he'd very likely die in prison, that his life would be destroyed wholly this time. I imagined Cave in jail, eating cubes of plankton protein in his gray prison uniform. I imagined Maggie devastated in her beautiful apartment. I imagined his son tragically triumphant wherever he was. I imagined his ex-wife, the elementary school students, his studio mates, all abandoned. What would be gained by his punishment? I asked myself. I searched for anger and indignation in myself and didn't find much. I drove to a hilltop overlooking the city and stopped at a park where clumps of eucalyptus and cactus grew. The trees were stunted and a wide view of the city's lights shimmered in the dusk. The sky was blood brown, streaked with orange and pink. A palm frond shifted in the breeze. I left the car on the shoulder and walked to a stone wall a few hundred yards away to sit down, unsure how far the car's halo of surveillance extended. I didn't trust Cave wasn't watching me. I gazed at the city and the gathering darkness below. My body wasn't in any kind of pain. My brain was working fine. Even my rash was quiet. The sky dimmed further, and a few pinpoints appeared in the haze, but only the strongest ones, the planets. End of the chapter. Thank you, sir. Yeah, so we can talk about many things. That little reference at the end to his rash and his feelings, he's been diagnosed with what might be a fatal disease that he's also kind of grappling with throughout this book, and that he is living in his own denial about. So that's the title, Denial. Yeah. What do you guys want to talk about?
How old are your kids?
My kids are 15 and 13.
So they
13.
inspire your writing about climate change?
Yeah, there might be an element to that. I mean, there is. I mean, this book definitely was a product of probably in particular events leading up to 2020. You know, aside from the you know, rise of fascism and the pandemic, the mega fires were an extremely bad thing. And that feeling, you know, of being swamped by the smoke during that summer in Portland was, yeah, really existentially terrible. So this, you know, this book was for me like just a way of trying to even imagine that a future could exist in a certain sense. Like I sort of set myself the goal of writing a non-apocalyptic futuristic book, a kind of post apocalyptic book, or like an anti-dystopian book, or the way I was thinking about it. And it was definitely like, yeah, thinking about future generations, you know, very specifically my own children. But also, yeah, just for myself and my friends and family. I mean, the idea of trying to like just imagine a horizon that was beyond the week's sort of news cycle was the sort of mental task I gave myself. And it turned out that like sort of 30 years, about the time of like a mortgage, you know, is about as far out as like humans can really think. And so that was as far as I could get. But I just wanted to yeah, just do that thought experiment. Like what could it possibly look like to hell with utopia, you know, like let's just think of like basic survival, you know, the stakes have become so much reduced. Yeah. Yeah, kids are part of it.
I know about-
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I love the idea about the trials and.
Yeah.
Like, is there something that's wrong? Is there something?
I'm sure we all agree with
that sets everybody on for?
Well, it's fairly vague about that. Like, I mean, this idea of Nuremberg style trials for ecological sort of crimes is an idea that has been floating around for a while. You know, I mean, it is, how exactly that would be accomplished is hard to tell. But there's the book refers to some little precipitating events and stuff that created the context for this mass uprising. But again, like having been composing this in 2020, as I was watching like the BLM movement outside my window, it became actually quite easy to speculate about that on like a more global level. You know, like this is a thing that happens. This is a sort of group dynamic that can suddenly emerge, and you know, and equally, you know, it emerges and then it collapses, and like everyone goes about back into their business. And I think, you know, the fantasy that it would be some perpetual state of like heightened consciousness doesn't jibe with my own understanding of human beings. I've met a few human beings in my life now, and like they don't behave that way. So but yeah, I mean, I was most interested in the kind of aftermath of the whole thing. Like, I think, you know, if I was like Kim Stanley Robinson or something, maybe I could have gone through the whole logistics of a global ecological movement and how that would work. But I wanted it to have that sort of more after the gold rush kind of feeling, you know, like this is people living in the kind of the hangover of that possibility. Yeah, which maybe is more downbeat than necessary, but
Yeah.
yeah.
The first time I heard.
Yeah, it's a thing that has kind of kicked around out there. Yeah, but I mean, as you might notice in even what I read, like it's a journalist story, but it's also, you know, kind of a detective story, and there's a noir element to this whole thing, and so that kind of burned out, and you know, somewhat cynical voice was part of the kind of genre that I ended up kind of adopting for this as well. Oh, yeah, okay, then we can go.
Oh, no, I'll have to read the book to find out how the journalist found the executive.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. You don't
Friend
wanna give
of
that.
his,
You don't wanna
but
give that
yeah,
out.
it's not that hard, yeah.
I was in a meeting yesterday evening, and which people somebody raised the question, did anybody here
think of anything in the Constitution on which you could base trying exactly the kind of people that you were saying were tried, and nobody could. So,
But that's what those kids are doing.
in the
And
novel, do you sort of say that they did it analogously with the Nuremberg trials, that they sort of made up some laws that they say, well, obviously.
yeah, I mean, they kind of extend the crimes against humanity concept from Nuremberg to crimes against life, you know, so it's not just a sort of a human crime, but an entire biome crime. And so it does in the book have legal precedent in that kind of international law for what that kind of international law is worth.
I'll have
you
to
know,
go ahead and
yeah.
read your book.
Yeah, but again, like it doesn't go super into detail. Like there's a certain grayness to how it all happened because it's like, well, because it's just so implausible, you know. I mean, it's kind of like there's a certain like leap of faith that the book takes that this is something that conceivably happened. But what you're talking about, you know, those teenagers in Montana are doing that, right? Didn't they? Isn't that where they sued the state government about? And I think they've won the first round. You know, I mean, it'll go on, but like clearly there's some way of framing the argument that exists within our Constitution. Yeah.
Yeah, just to add to that, there is some basis for that based on treaty agreements and support agreements. Human rights is, which actually takes precedence over law. And that in fact provides some kind of rationale.
Thank you.
Because there are both,
Yeah.
you know, social and civil rights that are guaranteed in the Universal Declaration. We just have civil rights, you know, social
Right.
rights. As soon as you expand into social rights, you have rights to personal well-being.
Right.
Thank you.
But as we've seen, there's a definite disparity between the law and reality, and like the actual holding people accountable to the law is highly, you know, varies. Yeah,
I
yeah.
have a question for you.
Yeah.
Just a philosophical, internal question. I think you're smelling some truth in this idea that we have to become more like ants.
Yeah, yeah,
You know, these problems are so vast.
yeah,
that, you know, dealing with huge societal problems historically in small communities has been successful with, say, benevolent dictatorships.
yeah, right.
There's some evidence and support for that, but very, very seldom
Yeah,
any kind of anything remotely close to it.
Yeah.
Do you feel personally that that's?
yeah. Well, I mean, I definitely have my days where I'm like, an eco-fascist wouldn't be so bad. I could live in eco-fascism. But that's only moments. Yeah, but it's true. Like, yeah, democracy is famously inefficient. That kind of concept that came up in that moment was kind of sprung in my head by that book Sapiens by what's his face, Yuval blah blah, I forget what his name is, but it's a whole history of kind of Homo sapiens that really does talk about each kind of major technological and just organizational corner that humanity has turned has sort of accomplished both this massive that has both been a kind of strengthened the sort of the species in a way, like it's created like a better sort of broadly better sort of lifestyle, but has also created less freedom for people. Like as you move from like, you know, tribal societies to agriculture, it's a industrial to whatever, like just society becomes increasingly regimented. And so yeah, that idea of I mean it's I mean there's a lot of philosophical grist in here because like it could be that, yeah, this fantasy of freedom, this idea of freedom is at this point a kind of vestigial sort of whimsy, you know. And like certainly for me, the people I see who are most adamant about their freedom tend to be the most objectionable people that I see. So it's like, and so like somewhere there was some twist in the Mobius where freedom became extremely offensive. So to me, you know, I'm not a freedom man, but yeah, but it's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I love it as if I know, and we're speaking as if I know anything about these philosophical questions, but yeah.
Just to dovetail what you said about reading Sapiens and then form.
Yeah,
Are there stages? I mean, I assume that when you're working on the book, you haven't given up reading, but you still read things, still kind things. Are there things that you encountered while writing this book that changed the direction of your
that's an interesting question. This was a strange book for me. I wrote it actually quite quickly for me. I mean, actually, I think for anyone, like, I mean, the initial draft happened in a really like a 6-month span. Like, and it's a short book. It's not and it's not that complex in its movements. So I sort of didn't have that much time to change. And it was an idea that is sort of high concept, this idea of like going and finding this guy and, having this series of conversations and whatever. It kind of, manifested quickly and probably didn't change that much. That said, like in other writing projects, that kind of new information or new concepts, I think, can irrigate the thing while you're working on it and warp it in interesting ways. And it's part of why, at least for me, it becomes important to read in a directed kind of way when I'm working on a particular project. Like I was realizing actually just walking around my house the other day, like it looks as if there's sort of no order to the bookshelves in our house. Like it's just these kind of weird random pockets. But to me, I look at them and like each one is a pocket of a different book or a movie. And it's like, here's like the pod of books that I had to use for this particular thing. And here's the one for that. And it's like, so they actually do have a sort of mnemonic device for myself, but they look utterly like jumbled. Yeah. And it can be, some of it's nonfiction, some of it's fiction, but it is, there's a kind of gestalt to it where it's like your process, what you're taking in, you're kind of putting out. And so you want to be mindful about it. Yeah. Yeah.
Did you have a very clear idea of the plot when you started, or did it evolve? Did the characters start speaking on their own and take you other places?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit, but this one had a pretty clear plot line. I mean, I like having a fair idea, like on an outline basis, to like map it out for myself beforehand, which is not to say it doesn't change a lot as it goes, but the idea, I know there's that idea of characters speaking to you and taking things in a different direction. And that can happen for me, like within a scene, like there might be like an interesting little bend in a conversation or something. But it rarely takes me way off course in a certain way. And that might partly have to do with sort of the way that I construct the characters and sort of the way that I melt them down from people that I actually know. Like they tend to be sort of based in usually people I went to high school with. And it's like, for me, like being able to sort of hear their voice, like know the grain of a character's voice beforehand is really helpful as far as understanding how they're going to behave in a different kind of situation. And it's not that it's like, here's one person. I mean, they do end up becoming composites, but like, I rarely will hear a voice that is not a voice that I've heard in real life. Yeah, personally. Yeah.
Are you a visual artist also?
No, but I write about visual art sometimes. I am have a kind of hobby of writing about visual art. Yeah. I like visual art. Yeah.
So, and we cheated, we read the book.
That's not cheating, that's extra credit. Yeah.
I'll be judicious about what I ask. One thing that struck me is sort of the details and descriptions of scenes.
Mhm.
Description of the scene with the car, the description of the scene
Right.
in the house, since you read them.
Yeah.
Right. as a sort of a contrast to things like what gave rise to the upheaval. There's some places where there's lots of detail.
Yeah.
And it's very vivid, and other places where it's much more, as you said,
Kind of grayscale. Yeah.
grayscale. And I'm interested just as an author,
Mhm,
having never attempted to write anything.
mhm.
Do you think about that consciously as a contrast as you're doing? How does that happen, and what's the thought process?
That is a good question. I don't know quite how it happens. I mean, I do enjoy describing things like actual
Yeah.
objects and like, yeah,
Shows
there is
you
a, yeah,
passion
there is
about
a,
visual arts.
there is a Greek word ekphrasis that I really like, which means the joy of describing a visual thing in words, which is a peculiar pleasure, but it is a distinct one, I think. And so I try to give myself that little ekphrastic thrill in the course of writing something. And but I don't know. Yeah, I don't feel like there's a huge design about it, you know. I mean, I guess I do find as the revisions add up and I become more comfortable in the sort of emotional foundation of a particular scene or chapter or sequence, that's then when I'm sort of free more to start describing visual stuff, and it's almost like frosting the cake in a certain way, you know, like you kind of know what is underneath it, and so now you can kind of just enjoy yourself and feel sort of calm enough to sort of think in that kind of visual register. So it does, I can at least say that it's kind of comes later in the process usually. Yeah, that's where the color comes in. Yeah, yeah.
Don't look up haunts me.
Oh,
Sorry.
yeah.
When you were reading, and I've been thinking a lot lately. I'm an environmental scientist, so
Oh,
I'm all
okay.
about like
Yeah,
nonfiction and science and fact, and I'm like flipping
Mhm.
out every day
yeah.
over the state of the world as so I think the trials are coming. It's about 20 years from now when the boomers are done. That's already,
Interesting.
and also
Yeah.
mom of a 7-year-old.
Yeah,
So
okay, yeah.
I guess I'm wondering, like, what role do you think fiction plays in the environmental movement in terms of the climate crisis? Like, did you think at all about like what you wanted your readers to take home?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I mentioned Kim Stanley Robinson earlier, and thankfully I had not read him before I wrote this book, but he's an amazing science fiction writer and ecological theorist in many ways. And he wrote a great book called Ministry for the Future that came out a handful of years ago that is about kind of humanity getting its shit together and actually like doing the things it needs to do to decarbonize and create a sustainable sort of planet. And it's extremely well researched. He is like a scientist also. I am radically not a scientist. Like I really don't understand things on that level. Nor am I ultimately, when it comes down to it, an activist for as much armchair bitching as I do about a lot of things in the world. Like, I mean, I'll go out and do my time on the streets and stuff, but I'm not you know, like a Naomi Klein kind of writer, or someone who like is writing to give ammunition to activists, you know, like that is not really where my own energy comes from. I have had some sort of twinges on this book that, you know, there is a kind of quietism that it could sort of engender, or a kind of fatalism, or a kind of, you know, lack of sort of activist zeal, you know, in the way that I've kind of written a story in which the work is done and like you're kind of living afterwards and is just sort of Monday morning quarterbacking it a little bit, you know. but the idea really was just to try and like, yeah, create. I guess I also though come. All right, that's actually I'll back into a different avenue on this. Yeah, I grew up on the West Coast among fairly new agey people, and the idea that you can somehow manifest your own reality, you know, was very much part of my um, uh, life and culture. You know that yeah, we can think our way into like a new reality in some kind of way, and I think one of the sort of more advanced correlatives of that idea is that you think about a thing as if it has already happened. You know, like you kind of you teach the world to treat you who you want to be by just acting like that already exists. You know, there's some in my science of magical thinking, like you take the extra step and like let the world catch up behind you in a certain way. And so that was sort of my spiritual philosophy about this. You know, like let's imagine the world that we want, and hopefully the world can organize into that way. That said, it has ended up being a somewhat like downbeat version of the future in this book, and it might not have been quite as optimistic as it could have been. But I don't know if that's really answering your question in any way. I think partly I was trying to write a book that sort of gave people some solace, you know, like, I mean, I was feeling so bludgeoned in that period of time. I mean, and continuing, but like really, particularly 2020 with the pandemic and the fascism and the fires, like that, like I wanted, yeah, I guess I just wanted to do some magical thinking, you know, that's what it is. And that is actually the saddest, sort of most direct interpretation of the denial title, you know, like this whole fantasy of a future world is a total act of denial. Not to be a total bummer about
the
it.
right people, the right ideas. That we get started now.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the ideas are out there, you know, like, I don't know why hearing it from me is going to change anyone,
Well, I
but
think
it's like,
the
it
different
is.
arts
Yeah,
though, like the science books, like there's not that many people that are actually
for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
so it's like having
Right.
it in fiction or having it in visual art or having
Totally. No, and I think the more that is sort of articulated out there, the better. But it's hard to say that. I mean, the information is there, you know, like we all pretty much know, you know. And if you don't know, then you're choosing not to, you know. Yeah.
Perhaps eco porn will be the next thing.
Yeah. How do you get it right directly into the deepest lizard part of someone's brain? Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm working on it.
Yeah. Yeah. Sounds kind of hot.
Always.
Here we go.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
Is this your only book with an ecological theme?
No, it's worked into other stuff. I mean, I wrote a movie that was about like direct action, eco politics, about some people blowing up a hydroelectric dam. And my last novel actually had a plot line about someone trying to corner the market on used water in the country, and like getting the rights to sort of wastewater and as a sort of speculative capitalist endeavor. So and then actually my first book had a lot of stuff about like the beaver trade, which is like a certain form of ecological something other. So it's like it's definitely it's been percolating in a lot of the books. Yeah, but not in a very like strident way. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Can you talk a little bit about your process between approaching a book as opposed to a screenplay, or about these two mediums?
Sure. Yeah. I have been very lucky to have a long-standing partnership with a very amazing director named Kelly Reichert, and we've done 6 movies together. That some of which have been based on my fiction, and some of which were written from as scripts. And what do I say about that? I mean, for me, the movies have kind of been a part of the fictive universe that I've been thinking about. You know, they feel continuous with the fiction. I mean, partly because three of them have been based on the fiction. They've all been quite regional, like all 6 films have been shot in Oregon and have dealt with different sort of elements of regional history. And the books have well, one of them was California, but they've all been very West Coast, very like Northwesty kinds of things. So they all kind of arise out of the same ecology in that way. Writing a book is way, way harder than writing a script, I will say. Writing a script is kind of like an outline. You know, there are a lot of overlaps, you know, like you have to think up the characters, you have to, you know, in the case with our films, like a lot of it is stems from locations that already exist. So there's kind of a, you know, setting that's being like very much conceptualized. You know, you have narrative arc and everything, but there's just all these other people in a film who are going to come in and like actually do the work of describing everything. And you know, writing a book is like you're in charge of every department. You know, you're the costumes, you're the like hair and makeup, you know, you're everything. So it's just, and just writing a paragraph is a lot harder than writing a whole script sometimes, you know. I mean, it's like to make a idea flow sentence to sentence and to like maintain breath, you know, through an entire book is just radically more labor. So it kind of depends who I'm talking to, how much I disparage screenwriting, you know, because you know, some people don't understand that you do anything, you know, like as the films that we do don't have a lot of dialogue, you know, and so people are like, well, what did you even do, you know? And it's like, well, I thought of the characters and the situations, and you know, it is like I did, you know, it is something. So if I talk to those people, I'm like, you know, screenwriting is very hard, and you need to, like, you need to really like respect it. But if I'm talking to like another writer, I'll be like, it's not that big of a deal, you know? Yeah. So I don't know. It's really great to get to do it because collaborating with people is really fun, and then also having your own thing that you are purely responsible for is also fun. So they're both kind of great. Yeah.
Well, so what's your actual process to write a book? Are you everywhere, or do you do it all digital, or is there a whiteboard? What's going on?
Not all digital. Okay. I'll be very literal. Often it starts with a legal sized pad of graph paper turned sideways. And well, I mean, first there's just a lot of thinking, you know, you're kind of walking around. It's like, oh, will this idea be anything? So there can be like months to years where you're kind of just like, yeah, maybe that would be something. But then when it starts to get down to actual thinking about it, I start just making columns of like, what would the first chapter be and the second chapter, and it's just sort of words, you know, and it sort of starts to spread out. And then it's like staring at this like pad of paper for, you know, weeks or months and being like, and it's really just sort of playing it in your head, you know, and then it just sort of becomes more and more detailed, and there's sort of more words and more sort of sections you start to understand. And then it's only after, yeah, quite a while of like doodling that it enters to the actual sentences being written. And I mean, for me, I need to write a lot of like sentence fragments first. Like I don't even necessarily write in full sentences for a while. Like it's just kind of like throwing up the stuff that I'm going to use. And then gradually it's almost like you're sort of making the clay, and then you kind of start molding your clay a little bit. But like I know there are much more intelligent writers who are able to just write a sentence and then write the next sentence. But like for me, it's more like I mean, it is more of a visual art thing almost, where I'm like sort of trying to kind of like shape it as it's like growing. It's more like watching spores grow than like something front to back, you know. So that's my process, which is not very efficient.
Last question.
Yeah.
Actually, it sounds really.
I just wondered, have you ever imagined yourself writing nonfiction someday?
That is a thought. Yeah. I have been having that thought. I mean, I've done a little bit. I've written essays here and there, you know, about different things. But thinking about what happened in Portland in 2020 does feel like a subject that we're going to be talking about for a very long time. And it's, you know, I'm like, someone should do that. And then I'm like, I'm like, actually, like, you know, I might be well placed to do it because I have been writing about, you know, the town and stuff for a long time. And so, yeah, I mean, there are some ideas but it's intimidating because, you know, journalism has its own incredible like batch of conventions and procedures, and it involves talking to people, which is harder than it sounds. But yeah, so I would like to do that at a certain point, and maybe that time is coming. Yeah.
I do have a question from someone online real quick.
Okay. I'm in no hurry. I'm
Okay.
just like, yeah.
Somebody wants to know how it feels to see your short story turned into a movie.
Yeah, you know, I've had a really like blessed relationship with Kelly, and the movement of the stories from prose into film has had actually a very organic kind of flow to it. And, you know, she's been really generous in including me, you know, well, I mean, I've been involved obviously in doing the adaptation, but then even as the filmmaking progresses, I'm able to be involved in the conversation to some degree. So it doesn't feel like the kind of violation that I hear other people having about their writing becoming film. Like I think for a lot of times people can have their book optioned and then the movie comes out later and they have had no relationship to it. And so for me, you know, I'm able to see the casting and I'm able to see the location scouting. And it's like, by the time the film comes, like I kind of already know what it's going to be like. And Kelly is I mean, literally one of the best directors in the world. So it's like, it only gets better in her hands. So I don't have the feeling of, unpleasantness. So very lucky. Yeah. Yeah. I'm happy to answer
Okay.
questions, but people can leave if you want
There's
to.
one back
Yeah.
here.
I don't want to make you feel trapped in this room, but.
I'm coming at you from a weird direction.
Yeah.
The big things is the screenwriters, you know, strike.
Yeah.
They're concerned about AI.
Hmm.
And my perspective, I'm an engineer and I understand all
Yeah.
this AI stuff, and it's a big disappointment for them
Hmm.
where they're currently at. Okay?
Right.
To me, writing is art. It's not something that you can take. Yep, a lot of writers, they have their formula.
Right.
They change places, they change some of the characters a little bit, but to read that time and time again, that's extremely disappointing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, to me, writing is art, and I don't
I
threatened by.
I don't feel threatened because it's like, I have the same feeling. I mean, it's like, I'm not going to let a computer eat for me or have sex for me either. You know, like, I mean, it's like, I want to do my own thinking. Like, I'm not here for the product. I mean, that said, like, yeah, I also think of hamburgers and cheese as food, but look what we've done to those, you know? I mean, it's like a lot of people don't have, it's just weird to me to find out how many people have no relationship to the process by which the thing comes to them, you know, like, oh, I love a rom-com, so I'll take a rom-com written by a robot, you know, like, and to me, it's just like, I'm like, I don't even understand how to like look at a piece of art without thinking of it as part of human intelligence, you know, like it just doesn't make sense. I mean, there's so much about the AI thing that I find so objectionable. like I'm trying to find ways to not be so objective, or not be so traumatized by it, I guess, or just so disgusted by it. You know, like again, like visual art wise, like I'm like, Andy Warhol would find a way to like AI. Like there's a way that, you know, there must be a way to find this like interesting as a tool, you know, like someone can do it. But largely there's just this hippie inside of me that's like, this is just an abomination. Like, why would anyone bother? You know? Yeah. Anyway.
Let's thank Jon for his time and for his generosity. Thank you. And I'm sure he'd be happy to stick around for another hour to answer.
Yeah, I'll loiter
Maybe
around.
those
Yeah.
books across the street.
No,
Oh,
but I do have,
Go visit 'em.
but I do
Yeah,
have
right.
one that I'm happy to part with, that he'll sign for you in a few minutes.
The date
Please,
starts when
please join us October 14th for our next reader, Craig Thompson. He's a graphic novelist.
That'll
So
be a good one.
thank you for coming.
Thank you, guys.